What's up, everyone? This session was played at Champions in Houston, Texas. It was initially a 5-10 game, but we quickly added on the $20 straddle. I flopped a bunch of monsters this session, but I had some less than stellar runouts, and I was put in some very difficult decisions. I hope that you enjoy. Right off the bat, I look down at pocket kings from middle position, and I open it to $60. Both the small blind and the big blind make the call, and we go three ways to the flop with the pot at $190. The flop is the 8 of spades, 6 of spades, 2 of diamonds, a board that's going to connect with the blinds much more often than it does with me. Both the blinds check. Generally going to be using small sizes, multi-way. I decide to size up a little bit more on this board specifically, as I do think that this interacts with both blinds range quite a bit, and they're going to have a lot of medium strength hands that do have to continue here. I size up to 125. The small blind folds and the big blind makes the call. I think the Duker is going to be continuing with all of his flush draws, straight draws, and pairs. I would expect him to primarily be folding overs and backdoors just because I'm betting multi-way. We go heads up to the turn with the pot at $440. The turn is the 5 of clubs. Not thrilled with this card as it does give my opponent some straights and 2 pair combos, but overall it's still going to be pretty good for me as they're going to have hands like 9-7, 8-7, 6-4 that have now picked up a straight draw along with their pair. You could also have something like the 5x of diamonds or the 5x of spades. My opponent also thinks this is a pretty good board for him as he decides to lead for $300 into 440. I think that my hand is way too strong to fold, but this is setting off alarm bells. I make the call and we go to the river with the pot at $1,040. The river is the 3 of hearts. Definitely not one of the rivers that I'm happy to see. If my opponent did have a hand that contained a 4, either the 4x of spades or something like 5-4 that was a pair and a straight draw, they could have been betting on the turn. My opponent could also have something like pocket 3s that they decide to turn into a semi-bluff and get a little protection from. They've now made a set. My range really doesn't contain any 4x here for the most part, except for possibly something like ace-4 suited when I'm opening from middle position and betting into the field. I'm a little bit handicapped here. My opponent decides to continue for a really large sizing, betting $950. In a vacuum, I have a reasonable call down here, but I think that this is a spot that is probably under bluff, so I decide to err on the side of caution and exploitatively make the fold. On the second notable hand of the night, the Duker opens up on the button to $60. A businessman calls in the big blind, and I look down at pocket 10s in the straddle. I bump it up to $300. I think that Duker is definitely opening up wide enough on the button, and I think that the businessman is going to have a relatively weak range when he calls in the big blind here. Duker 4-bets to $800. The businessman folds and I make the call. We go heads up to the flop with the pot at $1,665. I flop a very precarious set with the 6 of hearts, 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts. I check and my opponent continues here for about a third of pot, betting $550. The stack to pot ratio is a little bit awkward as we are playing 5, 10, 20. I think that my hand definitely wants a little bit of protection. I think if I shove here, I'm still going to be called by a lot of his overpairs, and I can also get called by the ace-king, ace-queen style of combos that do contain a stronger heart. I also don't expect my opponent to really be barreling at a very high frequency on the turn if they do have something like ace-king without a heart. So I really don't think I'm going to be gaining any additional value on further streets from those hands unless he hits specifically an ace or a king. Because of that, I try to maximize the value I can get against his heart combos, and I decide to shove in for my remaining $1,400. My opponent pretty much just snap folds, which is unfortunate because he's probably drawing dead, but that's okay. I still pick up this $2,200 pot. In this hand, I am against the same opponents as the previous hand. Duker opens up to $60 from the cutoff, and the businessman makes the call on the button. I look down at pocket 2s in the small blind. I don't think that my opponents in the big blind or straddle in this hand are going to be 3-betting at a very high frequency. I think this hand plays pretty well multi-way, so I make the call. We go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $210. And once again, I flop a pretty precarious set on the 6-3 deuce all diamonds flop. I check and flow to my opponent, and he continues here for $100. The businessman makes the fold, and I decide to raise to $350, really trying to gain value from all of his overpairs and his 1 diamond combos. When he's opening from the cutoff, he's going to be a little bit wider, and he'll have things like pocket fives, pocket fours that are also going to continue here, as well as a higher frequency of some of the 6x, 3x, and 2x combos. My opponent makes the call, and we go to the turn with the pot at $910. The turn is the 4 of hearts, bringing a 4-liner to a straight so that any 5x combo makes the straight. Not the greatest card for my hand, but I think that overall I'm still going to be ahead of my opponent here. My opponent is very unlikely to have too many 5x combos here. Realistically, it's only 6-5 and 5-4 that continue on the flop. In addition to pocket fives, my opponent can still have some made flushes here, but I think that I would have heard from them at a pretty high frequency on the flop as a re-raise. I expect my opponent to primarily have overpairs here that I think will continue to another bet, especially if I size down a little bit. I also think that he's going to continue a lot of his 1 diamond combos if I continue here for a small sizing. Generally, when the board becomes a little bit more dynamic after a check raise, I don't want to be going too huge, so I continue here for $350, trying to gain value from all the hands that I stated, in addition to having a combo that plays perfectly fine versus a raise, as I have the opportunity to make a full house or quads. My opponent does continue here for the $350, and we go to the river with the pot at $1,610. The river is the 5 of diamonds, not the card I was looking for, as my opponent does make the flush with a lot of their overpairs, as well as some of their stronger Broadway combos that contain a diamond. Kind of a weird spot for my specific hand, or really most hands in my range. I'm not really gaining any value from anything as there's a straight on board, so we're chopping with each other. I think that overall I have a ton more 7x combos, and I think that my opponent would have raised some of their flushes on either the flop or the turn. My entire range still contains a lot of the stronger flushes. I can also have all of the 4x of diamond combos that my opponent can't have, even though my opponent has a lot of the stronger pairs and stronger broadways that contain the ace-x of diamonds. They would have played a lot of them differently, and I think that I still retain a pretty strong range advantage. I can get my opponent off of a lot of chops, or possibly some of their weaker made flushes if they have something like pocket 9s, pocket 8s with a diamond. I decide to turn my pocket 2s into a bluff here, and I continue for $650. My opponent thinks for a little bit and does make the fold, so it's very likely that I did have the better hand the entire time until the river, and we were chopping on the river, but I think it's a good spot where I can steal the pot. Thankfully, I was rewarded. In this hand, I open up pocket 8s from the button to $60. Benzine calls in the big blind, go heads up to the flop with the pot at $145. The flop is the queen of clubs, 7 of clubs, 3 of spades. Benzine checks to me, and I decide to continue here. I think a hand like pocket 8s gains a lot of value from hands like 7x, 3x, and some of the weaker pocket pairs, in addition to some gut shot straight draws and some flush draws. My specific hand also really likes to fold out a lot of overcards, and denial is a big aspect of betting this hand. My opponent decides to raise to $160. Not a massive raise, but still a little bit scary. He's going to be doing this with some number of gut shots, a decent amount of flush draws, obviously sets, but I think he's going to be also value raising a lot of his stronger queen X combos. Kind of in a weird spot with pocket 8s. There's a ton of turn and river cards that are very poor for my hand, as stated. I am ahead of all of my opponent's bluffs, and I really don't block any of their bluffs. They're not going to have any 8x combos that are bluffing here. It's all going to be hands like 6-5, 5-4, and clubs. So due to the sizing, I decide to make a somewhat speculative call. We go to the turn with the pot at $465. The turn is the 5 of clubs. Don't love it because the flush came in, but I think that it does slow down my opponent if they have a queen X combo, a set, or something like 6-5 or 5-4. That was a gut shot that's now made a pair. My opponent can also possibly have complete air, and they'll just give up on this turn. My opponent does check, and I think that I have enough showdown value that I just want to check behind. We go to the river, which is the king of diamonds. Shouldn't improve either of us too often. It really only changes if he specifically has the king X of clubs. My opponent decides to lead river here with a very small sizing, betting about 1/3 pot. Generally, my hand is just going to be a fold here, but I think that this bet is signaling a lot of weakness. I wouldn't expect him to be betting any of his very strong made hands for this sizing. My opponent also checked the turns. It's very unlikely that they had a set or a flush here. His bet is telling me that he has a queen X combo, or does have something like the king X of clubs. Because I think that this bet isn't very strong from my opponent, I decide to raise to $650. My range still consists of a lot of the made flushes here. I can have some of the sets and 2 pair combos as well. Maybe not that I'm raising for this sizing. I think that my opponent is going to be relatively capped in this specific situation, and I can apply a lot of pressure here. My opponent does make the fold pretty quickly. I may have been ahead already, but regardless, I'm able to apply a lot of pressure on a relatively weak hand. This hand starts off with me opening Queen 10 offsuit from the hijack to $60. The Dock of Felt makes the call in the cutoff, and Benzene makes the call on the button. We go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $200. The flop is the 10 of diamonds, Queen of diamonds, Jack of clubs, giving me 2 pair, but a very, very wet board overall. Very happy to have 2 pair here. It's very unlikely that my opponents have a extremely strong hand, but they have a lot of medium strength hands. I would expect my opponents to primarily be 3-betting with hands like ace king and 10s through jacks. So I don't expect them to have a set. They could definitely have a better 2 pair like queen jack, or possibly a straight like king 9 or 9-8. Overall, I'm pretty happy to put some money in this pot. I see bet for $100. The Dock of Felt makes the call and Benzene folds. The Dock of Felt is going to be continuing here with all of his flush draws. He's going to have a lot of pairs plus straight draws. Hands like king queen, king jack, 10-9, pocket 9s. If he did have a made straight or a hand like queen jack, I would often see a raise here. We go heads up to the turn, which is the awful ace of hearts. Not the turn card I was looking for. Now any king is a straight. My opponent has a lot of king x of diamonds combos, as well as those king queen, king jack, king 10 combos. They could also have a better 2 pair here if they had something like ace jack or ace 10. I decide to slow down and try to pot control. I check, and my opponent decides to continue for $175. Not a massive bet. I think I do want to be continuing here at a pretty high frequency with my 2 pair combos. I do think that it's reasonable for me to fold here at some frequency. Queen 10 is often going to be too strong. I'm still ahead of all of his bluffs, and I have the opportunity to make a full house by the river. I continue with a call. We go to the river with the pot at $750. The river is the queen of hearts, giving me the full house now. I check and flow, hoping that my opponent now has that king x that I was so afraid of on the turn. My opponent decides to go very small and just throws out a $25 chip. I don't think that this bet really accomplishes too much. It doesn't make a lot of sense to be making very small bets when you're in position, because you can just check back and realize your equity. By betting very small, he does open up the action for me again. I'm not sure what he expected me to raise. Maybe he is trying to get raised by some of my bluffs. I decide to go very massive over this super small bet, and I make it 800. Really just trying to maximize my value against his made straights. I think that if I was bluffing with something like a missed flush draw here, I would also want to go very large. Maybe the size is a little too large for a king x combo to call. Regardless, I wanted to let him know that the $25 bet was completely unreasonable and put him to the test. He tanks and he does make the fold. So I'm not sure if there was too much more value to be gained there with my full house. In this hand, we are playing the small blind game, trying to spice it up and do something a little bit differently. Essentially, everyone starts by putting $25 on the button, and every time the button moves, the player that receives the button puts an additional $25 on there. This bounty that is sitting on the button can only be won by the small blind player. The button straddles to $10 and the action will start in the small blind. In this hand, Astro limps the small blind and I open up the big blind with ace 10 of diamonds. Dukter on the button calls the $60 and the initial limper also makes the call. And we go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $185. The flop is a good one for me as I flop nut flush draw and top pair on the queen of diamonds, ace of clubs, 6 of diamonds board. The small blind checks and I decide to continue here for $100. Dukter makes the call and Astro folds. I'd expect Dukter to be continuing here with all of his ace x, a decent amount of his queen x, and all of his draws. Even though I'm betting multi-way, he is in position and he is incentivized to limit the opportunity of the small blind player to win the pot. We go heads up with the pot at $385. The turn is the 3 of hearts. This should be a pretty blank turn. My opponent really shouldn't have pocket 3s. It really only changes if they have exactly ace 3. Because I retain the nut advantage, it makes a lot of sense for me to bet large here. I continue for $300. To my surprise, my opponent does make the raise to $1,000. There's not a ton of value hands that he does have here. There's going to be a set of 6s and there's going to be ace queen. He could have turned the ace 3. I expect him only to have ace 6 and ace 3 suited. So realistically, there's only one combo of those. And I would expect hands like ace queen to 3-bet a high frequency preflop and a hand like ace queen and pocket 6s to raise on the flop on this very dynamic texture. Regardless, I have the nut flush draw and a reasonable kicker. So I think here continue. There's definitely some merit for me going with my hand, but I do have a showdownable hand with a lot of additional equity. I want to keep my opponent's bluffs in there as well. I make the call and we go to the river with the pot at $2,000. $2,385. The river is the 6 of clubs. Pretty good river for me. It reduces the chance of my opponent having pocket sixes. At this point, it's very hard for them to have too many value hands. Obviously, I would have preferred a diamond, but what can you do? The other fortunate thing about this river is if my opponent did have something like ace jack or ace 3, I am now chopping with them. I check and my opponent thinks for a little bit and decides to shove all in for the remaining 2,900, over betting the pot and putting me in a very uncomfortable spot. As stated before though, I think it's very difficult for my opponent to have a value hand here. If they have the ace 6 of spades or pocket sixes, then they're just gonna get my stack. I'm beating all the bluffs still, and I think that I have a pretty trivial call when I think it through. I flick in the call. My opponent flips over ace 3 of spades, so they did turn the 2 pair and they got counterfeited on the river, and they decided to push all in to try to get me off of a chop. Pretty good play by my opponent. Pretty unfortunate river for him, but he did get a little bit lucky on the turn, as he's essentially only drawing to the 3 of hearts or 3 of clubs. When he's blocking full houses here, I think it makes a lot of sense for him to apply pressure on my ace-x holdings. He gets in trouble occasionally if I have a hand like ace king or ace queen, but I think against a lot of opponents, he definitely does fold out hands like ace jack, ace 10, ace 9. A very interesting line by my opponent on this pretty interesting run out. The small blind game is still going on. My overall strategy from the small blind is to limp a high frequency of my hands. I get to see flops for cheap with the opportunity to win a huge bounty, and with all of my stronger hands, I'm able to 3-bet and try to isolate. Unfortunately, this hand I was planning on 3-betting, and that plan does not really work out well, as once I limp, 4 other players decide to over limp, and we go 5 ways to a flop. The flop is the queen of clubs, 10 of hearts, 4 of spades. Pretty happy with my top pair and very good backdoors on this flop. I decide to thin the field a little bit and continue here for $40. The boss makes the call in the straddle. Astro makes the call on the button. We go to the turn with the pot at $175, and the turn is the 4 of hearts, giving me the flush draw. The 4 is probably a pretty good card for me, as I don't expect my opponents to have too much 4x. I think it's unlikely that the boss calls too often with a 4x combo, as he would have to limp it pre-flop and then decide to call the flop with multiple players behind, but it's definitely possible. It is more likely that Astro has the 4x, as he's getting an incredible price pre-flop, but I would expect him to be folding at some frequency with his 4x on the flop. But myself and the boss have both shown interest in this pot. I decide to continue here for a size of $140. I think it's getting a little bit thin, as my opponents could possibly have a stronger queen x, but I think when they limp here pre-flop, they also have a ton of the weaker queen x hands. There's also hands in their range like king jack and jack 9 that have open enders. They could have picked up a flush draw, so I think it's reasonable to continue here. The boss folds in the straddle, and Astro continues here. We go to the river with the pot at $455, and the river is the 9 of diamonds. Not a horrible river card, but also not my favorite. Queen 9 gets there against me, and so does king jack. The 9x also makes it so that my queen x is counterfeited versus all of the weaker queen x that my opponent could have. Although to be fair, the vast majority of the deck does that. I think at this point, once my opponent has called twice, I just want to go into pot control mode. But I think there's a reasonable amount of hands that do beat me, and I'm out of position, so I'm gonna check and let my opponent decide. This may have been a mistake, as my opponent decides to overbet for $625. I'm not entirely sure if my opponent would overbet with a stronger queen x combo or something like queen 10 or queen 9. So at this point, they are telling me that they have a 4x combo that did not raise turn, or something like king jack. I'm in a pretty tough spot here. I'm getting crushed by a 4x combo, but like I said, I don't think it's super likely that my opponent has a 4x. My thought process at the time was I do block some of those queen 10, queen 9 combos if my opponent does have something like that. I also block the king jack straight. I have a reasonable bluff catcher. It's possible that my opponent would turn something like jack 10, 10 9, or jack 9 into a bluff, but looking back, there's not too many natural bluffs. I do wish that I folded, even if I do have a very good bluff catcher. I make the call. My opponent does show the king jack offsuit for the rivered straight, and I lose this $1,700 pot. Definitely think I could have minimized the damage on that final hand, but I'm very happy with the results, as I made about $1,200 this session. As always, I appreciate everyone tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys in the near future. Thanks.